The Mirror Doppelgänger. The old mirror sat in the corner of Emma's new apartment, almost hidden by shadows. Its thick, ornate frame was tarnished, the silver dull with age, and it gave off an unsettling aura that seemed to demand attention even in its silence. Emma hadn't brought it in herself. No, the mirror had been there when she'd arrived. Her landlord said it had been in the apartment for years, even before his time, passed from one tenant to the next. She was free to keep it or get rid of it. Emma had thought about throwing it out several times, but something held her back. Maybe it was the old-world beauty of the carvings around the edges, or perhaps it was her own fascination with old, mysterious objects. She felt a strange pull whenever she looked into it, as though it invited her in, revealing secrets only it knew. And so, the mirror stayed. For the first few weeks, Emma barely noticed the mirror. She would pass by it while she hurried to get ready in the morning, catching only quick glimpses of herself as she went about her day. But soon, things started to change. At first, it was just subtle oddities, a sense that something was slightly off, a flicker of movement when she wasn't looking directly into the glass. One night, while brushing her hair, Emma noticed her reflection moving out of sync. She froze, staring at her reflection. Her doppelganger in the mirror paused, tilting its head just a fraction too late. Emma shivered, brushing it off as fatigue, and went to bed. But it happened again. A week later, as she was applying makeup, her reflection smiled before she did. The smile was wider, almost grotesque, like it was stretching her face into a mask of joy that her real self didn't feel. Emma gasped and backed away, but her reflection didn't move. Instead, it simply watched her, its eyes dark and unblinking. Emma told herself it was just a trick of the light, a product of her own exhaustion. But the unsettling incidents grew worse. She started seeing her reflection even when she wasn't standing in front of the mirror. Out of the corner of her eye, she would catch glimpses of her own face staring at her from the shadows or following her through her apartment. The more she saw it, the more she noticed its differences. The doppelganger seemed older, somehow darker, with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't reach its eyes. And then there were the dreams, visions of the doppelganger reaching out of the mirror, crawling toward her with a desperate hunger. Emma tried to ignore the dreams, but they left her restless and exhausted. Her coworkers noticed her change in demeanor. She was becoming distracted, easily startled, and she started to avoid mirrors altogether, doing everything she could to avoid the gaze of her own reflection. One evening, as she lay awake in bed, Emma heard the faint sound of whispering. She thought it was the wind until she realized the voice was her own, calling softly from the living room. "Emma, Emma, come here." A cold dread filled her as she got out of bed, moving slowly toward the living room. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as she approached the mirror. She could see her reflection standing there, grinning that awful, distorted smile. The reflection raised its hand and beckoned her closer. Emma shook her head, taking a step back. "No," she whispered, "this isn't real." But the doppelganger's grin widened, and its hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed as if testing its limits. Emma stumbled back, her pulse racing, feeling the pull from the mirror like an invisible thread tugging at her. The doppelganger mouthed something she couldn't understand, but the intensity of its gaze was unmistakable. It wanted to get out. The following days became a waking nightmare. The doppelganger appeared everywhere, in windows, glass doors, even the reflective surfaces of her phone. It was always just a little closer, a little more real, as if it were breaking through the boundary between its world and hers. Then the incidents escalated. One evening, Emma came home to find her belongings rearranged, her clothes strewn across the floor. Her favorite sweater was stretched and torn, as though someone had tried to pull it on and had ripped it in frustration. The dishes she had washed that morning were now dirty and piled in the sink, and a faint smell of her perfume lingered in the air. Panicked, she called her best friend, Sarah, explaining everything in rushed, breathless sentences. Sarah suggested she stay at her place for a few days to clear her head. Emma readily agreed, packing her bags in a hurry, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that had taken over her apartment. But as she reached the door, she caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. She froze, the hairs on her neck prickling with dread. Her doppelganger was there, standing behind her, grinning, with a sharp intake of breath. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, only to see her own terrified face staring back. "Stay," the reflection whispered, lips moving silently against the glass. "Stay with me." Emma bolted, not looking back until she was safely in her car, driving away from the apartment as fast as she could. She spent the night at Sarah's place, but sleep didn't come easily. She couldn't shake the feeling that the doppelganger was somehow watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. In the days that followed, Emma tried to avoid mirrors entirely. But the doppelganger's influence seemed to spread. She began seeing herself in places she shouldn't, reflected in the glossy pages of magazines, in the glint of a polished doorknob, even in her own dreams. And every time she saw it, the doppelganger looked more real, more alive. One morning, Sarah noticed the dark circles under Emma's eyes, the way she flinched at every reflective surface. "Emma, you need to see someone about this. It's like you're haunted or something." Emma laughed bitterly. "Haunted by myself. How's that for irony?" But Sarah wasn't amused. "Maybe there's something wrong with the mirror. Maybe it's cursed or, I don't know, but you have to do something." Desperate, Emma agreed. That evening, she returned to the apartment with a hammer in hand, determined to smash the mirror. She could feel her pulse racing as she entered the living room, the air thick with a suffocating tension. The mirror stood in its usual place, dark and silent. Emma lifted the hammer, her hands shaking as she approached the mirror. But as she raised it over her head, her reflection moved, not in unison, but independently, like it had been waiting for this moment. The doppelganger's eyes gleamed with malice, and it smiled, tilting its head in mock pity. "You can't get rid of me, Emma," it whispered, voice dripping with venom. "I am you." Emma froze, the hammer slipping from her hands. The doppelganger's face twisted into an expression of triumph, and before she could react, it pressed its hands against the glass, pushing outward. The mirror began to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Emma took a step back, but the doppelganger's hand burst through, grasping her wrist with a grip colder than ice. She screamed, struggling against its hold, but the doppelganger's strength was inhuman. With a sickening lurch, it pulled her forward, her body sinking into the glass like quicksand. She clawed at the edges, desperate to free herself, but the mirror swallowed her whole. When Emma opened her eyes, she found herself on the other side of the glass. Her apartment looked the same, but it felt different, as though she were seeing it through a fog. She pounded on the glass, screaming, but no sound escaped her lips. And then she saw her doppelganger, now free, standing on the other side, staring at her with a look of cruel satisfaction. It raised a hand in mock farewell, its fingers waving slowly. Emma's heart pounded as she watched the doppelganger turn away, taking her life, her body, her very identity. She was trapped, a prisoner in the mirror, condemned to watch as her own reflection lived her life. Days turned into weeks, then months. Emma's despair deepened, her screams fading into silence. And every night, she would see her doppelganger through the glass, living her life with twisted pleasure, while she remained trapped in the darkness, a silent observer. And as time passed, Emma's face began to change, mirroring the twisted features of her captor, eyes hollow, smile stretching too wide, an echo of the horror that had stolen her life. If anyone else were to find that old mirror, they might just see a faint, hollow-eyed figure staring back, silently pleading for freedom. But beware, because the mirror does not let go easily, and sometimes it's not your own reflection staring back.